So we're now going to look at vendor prefixes and exactly what they are, why you should use them, and why they're even there in the first place, because this can be a little bit confusing. Now, because with CSS and CSS3, new features, if you like, or new things, new style, and new properties are implemented or proposed all the time, what happens is browsers are independent entities in the web industry. They implement functionality into their browsers at different rates. Chrome, for example, might implement a new feature before anyone else does. And you have browsers like Chrome Canary, which are basically nightly builds of the browser. They're not specifically versioned and released to the public. And what these do is contain the very latest features, even if they're not quite stable. So I'm not going to go into the massive detail of the process, but basically a proposal will be submitted and then it would be looked at and then voted on, I guess, commented on, improved, blah, blah, blah. And then eventually it would work its way into your browser. Again, because we're not rendering anything on the server, everything's done on the browser, it's up to you as a web designer or web developer working on the front end to actually look at how different things are going to look in different browsers. So for example, let's go over to a gradient generator. This is just on css3factory.com. Now we can generate a gradient sample, and it's really great that now we can use gradients. We spoke about this a little bit earlier on in the series when we had buttons. Whereas before you would have to do things like create the border radius within Photoshop, you'd have to create the gradient within Photoshop, perhaps even create the text if you wanted a shadow on the text. But all of these visual elements are available to us with CSS3. However, if we scroll down and look at what this gradient sample here has generated in terms of its code, this looks a little bit overly complicated. But what we're going to do is we're going to just copy this. We're going to head over here and we're going to create a div here, and we're going to give that a class of box again. And over in our main style sheet, let's create a selector and let's just paste this in and indent it. And then we'll talk about why all of these things exist and what sort of order they should be in. So let's create this as a width of 100, just so we can see it, and a height of 100 pixels. There we go. So in older browsers like IE7, because they, at the time of them being built or released, they had no idea that the spec for the gradient would be even proposed. So because Internet Explorer doesn't have auto updating, it means that a lot of people are still stuck on older browsers like IE7 and IE8. And this gradient would just not work. Unfortunately, I can't show you because I'm on a Mac. But if you are using Windows, try and grab a gradient and have a look at it in an older version of IE. And to get an older version of IE, you just hit F12 on your keyboard to bring up the developer tools. And then you can go ahead and choose your version of IE that you want to render. So anyway, we've got this gradient. It looks great on Chrome, brilliant. But it looks great on all of these browsers that we support, and we'll go through each one in a moment, because we have vendor prefixes. So WebKit is Chrome's rendering engine as well as Safari. So that's just the way that the CSS is rendered. Things are implemented slightly differently between the two, so things will look different on Safari to Chrome. So just because they both use WebKit doesn't mean that they're both going to look exactly the same. And what we have here is we have a Chrome implementation of this, and this has been broken onto multiple lines just to show the implementation. Now, if you actually look at this, you can see, if we just pull this up just so it's a little bit more consistent with the others, this will create a really long line, which is probably not recommended. You should probably break things down onto separate lines just so it's more readable in your text editor. But either way, we've got this WebKit gradient property. The actual property itself is gradient here, this gradient property here. So this is WebKit's implementation of the gradient property, and this is how it looks. We also have linear gradient as well, and this is Opera's implementation of the linear gradient property. We have this hyphen, then the name of the vendor prefix, and then, or the name of the vendor, and then the another hyphen, and then the property name. That's how it looks for everything. So for example, before border radius was properly supported, you would have border radius, you would have WebKit border radius, and then you would do something like 5 pixels. We've already looked at border radius, so it's a really good example. Maybe WebKit text shadow. And you can still use these vendor prefixes if it's applicable. So for example, if a user is using an older version of Chrome and hasn't updated for whatever reason, then the vendor prefix may only be the one that works. And that is the case for newer technologies at the time of recording, like things like transitions. You'll need the WebKit prefix for it to be able to work in Chrome and Safari. So we've got Opera here, we've got linear gradient, linear gradient, linear gradient. You can see here that they all use the same implementation, but this isn't always the case. Sometimes browsers have different ways of implementing them. They'll use different parameters here for these, which are essentially functions, I guess, and it can get a little bit confusing. So at the moment, if you go ahead and check caniuse.com, we can go ahead and check, say, linear gradient. There we go. So we get CSS gradient. This is basically going to tell us how this is supported within the different browsers. So you can see here that if it's got this little yellow thing here, it says WebKit. So for example, let's say we want to check how well supported this gradient is across all browsers. We come over to caniuse.com, and we'll be talking about this later on in the series. In IE, it's supported in 10 and it's supported in 11. Good. What about Firefox? Well, it's supported in 30, 31, blah, 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 blah. Same with Chrome, supported upwards. When we get to sort of older versions of Safari, we need it supported with WebKit prefix. It's supported with WebKit prefix on the Android browser from previous versions. So you probably would want to include the vendor prefix because it's likely that someone's going to have an older Android browser version. And the same with BlackBerry as well. It currently supported, but it does need the WebKit vendor prefix. And you can also check out other things here, but we'll talk about them later. So in this case, it's probably a good idea to actually use the vendor prefix. So, you know, there's all sorts of things you can do here. But there is obviously a downside to doing this. One of the downsides is that you are adding more complexity to your code. It's harder to maintain. Oh, I actually forgot to mention that we have the standard implementation with no vendor prefix last here. And that's because if none of these are used, for example, if WebKit's implementation is, this is no longer required, all the way down to linear gradient, then we just end up with a linear gradient. And once it's fully supported across all platforms, we just do this, delete it, and there, we've got linear gradient. So the second downside to this is obviously we're creating more lines of CSS, and therefore the CSS file is going to be a lot larger. If we were to just get rid of this, no, we'll keep it actually, and we'll go over to the website, we'll pull up the network tab, and let's give that a refresh. So main.css at the moment is 526 bytes, but without this, it's only 110 bytes. So you can see the difference that this makes, and obviously in that case it's being downloaded at roughly the same time, 1 millisecond, so it doesn't really matter too much in this case. However, when you're talking about a full website, if you're using lots of vendor prefixes, you'll get to the point where this will increase the size of your style sheet significantly enough to perhaps slow it down with those with lower speed internet connections. So this is just an example of something that requires vendor prefixes. Although it looks as though, according to caniuse.com, the support for this is pretty good. So we could technically remove that. Not this linear gradient here. So that's basically vendor prefixes. If you are worried about supporting newer features and you wanted to go ahead and check, head over to something like Caniuse or even the W3C and just have a look at how this has been implemented and what stage it's at, and whether you need to use vendor prefixes or not.